After bursting on the scene in the first decade of the 20th century, newspaper comics were exploding in popularity. Weekend sections went from 4 pages to 8, then to 16, and even 32 by 1935. And all those pages made room for a flood of new strips by a talented group of cartoonists. There were long-running stories, increasingly complicated characters, and plot lines filled with newsprint. We'll see the first appearance of Barney Google, Blondie, Uncle Walt and Skeezix, characters who still appear in newspapers today. With a massive, colorful canvas to explore and seemingly endless creative possibilities, comic strips would never again be so glorious as these pre-war decades. Today on Truth, Beauty, Comics.
Welcome to Truth, Beauty, Comics. I'm Levi, a cartoonist.
And I'm Felix, the guy who likes comics.
And this is the podcast where we look for transcendence in a pulpy medium. Today we'll be continuing our series on the Smithsonian collection of newspaper comics, and we'll specifically be looking at the third chapter, some selections from there today. And if you're on YouTube, look up our channel because we will actually have video for this episode, and you can kind of see some of the strips that we're looking at, and some of them are very beautiful. But yeah, Felix, so we kind of had the wild and wacky early days of comic strips. I think we're getting to something a little bit. I mean, certainly more recognizable in that some of these strips are still being published today. But yeah, what was anything jump out at you as kind of where comics have been going in these decades? Versus what we looked at last time?
The things we read for today felt much more recognizably like, big Sunday newspaper strips, right? They were larger. They were more beautiful. There was more attention given to them, I think, by the artists and writers, but they were in a good way, I think, a bit less experimental in that they'd sort of figured out a little bit of the recipe, but they were not yet formulaic. Because it's really strange. Those very early strips that we talked about a couple episodes ago, they were, for me, so many of them were kind of incomprehensible.
Yeah, same.
And these, it's like, okay, I understand this setup. There's a family and they're, rich or they're poor or they're stupid or they're smart or or there's a guy who travels or whatever. And also there was a bit more of, it was closer to the setup of newspaper strips that I'm used to, where you get a punchline at the end.
Yeah.
And so that also, I had kind of more of a sense of the basic underlying geography of a comic strip there was more in common with, so it was just more approachable, and because of that, I think I kind of liked some of them a bit more. I was particularly impressed, though this one is not an especially funny one, by the Sunday Gasoline Alley strips, because that's a comic that I'd heard people talk about, and I'd encountered it at various times, but I'd never seen the classic Sunday pages where they had this. I mean, at least the ones that were here were experimental in a really evocative way, and they were kind of reflective. And, I can see why they fit, a sort of lazy Sunday afternoon.
Right. Yeah. I'd say that the experimentation doesn't. Yeah. Yeah. Sorry. Because I love those too. Those are fantastic. We'll definitely dig into those, I think. But the experimentation, I think, that we're seeing is less just totally inscrutable, right? Which was it felt like some of the early stuff is just, it's interesting, it's weird, it's out there, but it's also just, what does this mean? It might as well be in a different language, some of it. I'm curious to get your thoughts on this, because I'm noticing that this is also an era that I at least have some exposure to through Hollywood. So this is like, if you think about early Frank Capra kind of, we're talking the 30s, like maybe the 20s, not so much, right? But that's when Hollywood also is starting to, get bigger, right? Movies are becoming more of a thing. It's becoming more of a pastime as well. So as we were reading these, I'm like, okay, some of these character archetypes that we're seeing feel like something out of It Happened One Night by Frank Capra, or something like that, or Top Hat with Fred Astaire, or early kind of stuff like that, where you have the working class schlubs kind of, then you have like more high society, and the jokes are they're archaic, but they are like recognizably jokes.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't know. I don't know if that's something that maybe also kind of is, we're in a world where that is more recognizable to us through film, even maybe. I don't know.
Yeah, that might be true, because once you start getting sound in film, the plots become right. Like you can pick up a movie from the late 40s, and there are myriad differences, and it's likely to be sort of, frankly, of higher quality if it's one that's survived than the average film being released today. But it's still sort of very recognizably a movie. You kind of recognize characters and things about the way that scenes are staged. Yeah, and I would be interested to learn a bit more about some of the influences kind of in either direction, right? Sort of comics to newspaper comics to film, and film to newspaper comics, and how much of it was kind of intentional influence or cribbing, and how much of it was just like the society, right, was shared, right? It's not quite the society that we live in today. And so there were things kind of taken for granted, and that were just part of the sort of social fabric that is necessarily kind of going to be showing up in comics and film and novels and music and just sort of all the arts.
Well, I guess one of the things too that's interesting is some of those early strips almost feel like vaudeville or like Punch and Judy almost. It's just they're so weird that it's like this is like humor from an era that I don't recognize, right? And as we get into the 20s and the 30s, now I'm like, oh, okay, this is humor that I recognize now. These are jokes that are old, but they just kind of make more sense to me than something like the Yellow Kid or something, where I'm just like, this makes zero sense. I do not understand what's going on here, even as impressive as the art can be in those times.
Yeah.
And there's continuity too. I think that's one of the things that's noticeable here is there's characters and continuity, right? So there's reoccurring people. They're doing artistic experimentation, but there's like more of a central grounding of a cast, it seems like, which maybe there wasn't some of those, but it didn't seem like you were actually dealing with characters that had, traits in some of those. So this is more kind of like, it's in the same kind of conventions as like Peanuts even, or something like that, or Calvin and Hobbes, where you have recurring characters, people to explore, kind of like an adventure on a page.
Yeah, and I think before this, I mean, not that there aren't sort of throughout the whole history of newspaper comics, tropes and that sort of thing, but it's sort of like before this, I feel like recognizable characters were a kind of just one trait. They're just sort of the bad rich guy or the troublemaking kid, or pick a sort of set of sort of a trait, and that's still present here. But I think there are a lot more characters where there's just like a little bit more of a sense that there's a person there.
Yeah. Well, I have kind of, I think from this chapter, let's see, there's kind of 4 that jumped out at me. The Gumps being one, Polly and her pals, Barney Google and Sparkplug, and then Gasoline Alley. I don't know if that matches up with some of the ones that you saw, if you want to talk through, or maybe we could just kind of.
Yeah, and this is really sort of your playground. I've read it, but you're the one who really knows this. So I'm happy to be kind of guided through these and sort of spark the discussion as you. But yeah, I agree. The Gasoline Alley, as I said, especially, and I have to say, the Gumps was like a little bit strange. I'll be interested to hear kind of what grabs you about the Gumps. And I was really struck by Polly and her pals also, just artistically.
Yeah, so I mean, there's some interesting ones in this first. I thought the Smiths was kind of interesting. There's some definitely kind of high class, kind of some ethnically insensitive humor, but I also wasn't sure if the joke was on the actual people. I think, or
I think I was actually, I wanted to talk about this one for that reason, because I thought the use of ethnic humor here was actually really interesting. Because
it's kind of progressive.
It because right, the sort of setup. I thought it was Smythe's, but maybe it's Smith's.
Oh,
The
you might be
setup is
right.
basically these like terrifically rich people, and judging also from the other Smythe strip or Smith strip that's in there, it is sort of supposed to be poking fun at them, and sort of see these
Mm-hmm.
ridiculous people with their opulent wealth. And so I was struck by this, right? And excuse my use of a ethnic slur, but the father says, "Oh, I want to go get some chop suey," and chop suey at this time. I read a book a few years ago about the like history of Chinese food in America, and chop suey was like
Oh,
the sort of thing that Americans loved. Um, and it's funny because now it's sort of the thing that's on the buffet, but you don't actually get it because it doesn't look that good.
right,
But it
right.
was a big deal then.
Okay.
So he suggests, "Oh, let's go down and get some chop suey," and the kid, says, "You said something, Pop," because he doesn't know what chop suey is. Uh, and the lady says, "Oh, do you think it would be safe to take the children?" He says, "Safe as church." And the kid says, "Oh, rats, I ain't afraid of." And they sort of are going, and they're the mother is very suspicious and thinking, "Oh, this is a dangerous place, this Chinese restaurant," and the wife is saying, "Oh, like I don't want to eat this. I'm not very hungry. Bird's nest soup. This doesn't sound good." And so they get chop suey, and she's saying, "Oh, what on earth is it made of?" There's this one line that I just laughed at. I don't know what the joke is precisely supposed to be at the time, but when the mother tells one of the kids, eat with your sticks, dear, or the Chinaman will be very angry."
Right.
And then afterwards they go to this ice cream parlor and each have 3 bowls of ice cream. And the boys are feeling really ill by the time they get home. And the woman says, "I knew very well that Chinese food wouldn't agree with them." And then one of the kids says another sort of ethnically distasteful thing about the yellow devils trying to poison them.
Right.
And yeah, there is like I think this is sort of uh commentary on uh kind of the way someone blaming their own sort of poor decisions on the impact of
Right.
immigrants.
Yeah.
But sort of it was quite funny, honestly. I laughed several
Yeah.
times while reading it.
Yeah. And from a higher,
And
yeah,
if I'm not
exactly. I think
mistaken,
this. I was just gonna say it's. I mean, the joke is they're eating way too much. They have like 3 bowls of ice cream, and then blames everything
yeah.
on the Chinese, and then but it's also interestingly recognizably funny. I think the jokes too. There's jokes here. Yeah.
And interestingly, in the little sort of introductory material, it was talking about the cartoonist, Ray Irvin. Um, it said it's sort of one of the few times when New Yorker cartoonists did newspaper strips. And the New
Interesting.
Yorker cartoon, I don't know that much about sort of what New Yorker cartoons were like 7,500 years ago. I don't know that they were around 100 years ago, but uh, I know what they're like now, and they're a really strange thing, right? Because they like
Mm-hmm.
very rarely. I subscribe to the New Yorker, and like it's it's a strange magazine because it'll be you might have an issue where there's nothing whatsoever that appeals to me, and then I might have an issue that has 5 excellent articles that I'm really interested in. So it's a
Mm.
very uneven publication, but the comics in them, the cartoons in them, like are very rarely actually funny precisely. Even when I sort of totally
Yep.
get what they're going for, like they don't elicit a laugh the vast majority of the time. Um, and so it was kind of interesting to see New Yorker cartoonist going for a more uh let's say standardized kind of comic strip.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree. I have a friend. This is a bit of a side, but who's had cartoons published in the New Yorker. Former coworker of mine, Evan.
Cool.
But that's kind of if you get published in the New Yorker, it's it's one of those weird magazines that it's still like the cartoons have like a very high like social kind of impact for whatever reason. They're
Yeah,
well
it's
known.
kind of a cachet.
Yeah, I've never been a big fan myself, but they are something. They've been around for a while.
Yeah. All right, now sell me on the Gumps, because I know you said that you really like, and I did not. I tell me why the Gumps is great.
Well, okay, I don't know if I can make the case that the Gumps are great, but I think there's even on these two here, which might not be the best examples. But I think there's something about the art to me that almost has, especially on the adventure kind of strip here, um, almost has like an early kind of like an Hergé-esque quality to it. It's not really Linclair, but it's well designed characters that are simply drawn, but there's also just a lot of kind of intricate detail that he puts in here. So I think that's the place that's always caught my eye, just from an artistic standpoint with the Gumps. But I guess where I'd say the Gumps are interesting is so they're one of these examples of which Gasoline Alley is also an example, and some of a kind of long running comic strip. I think it ran for like 40 years, centered around a family. And it's more of an example, I think, of kind of cartoonists exploring kind of what the medium can do. So there, I've always tried to track down collections of the Gumps. Particularly, I'd love to read this whole, because they were also one of the first adventure strips. So this kind of the City of Gold is like an early adventure, of which this is the only page I've ever been able to come across. But they're also over their 40 years. The one that's been published, I think, by IDW is a story called The Saga of Mary Gold, and you can find it like on Amazon. I think it's still in print, or at least you can find cheap copies of it. But it's kind of this like melodramatic story that takes place with all these characters, and it's like the first death that ever happens in a comic. A major character dies in it. That had a huge impact. Like, people were, writing in. There was all these calls to all the newspapers when it happened, and it's very melodramatic. But it's an interesting enough story, and kind of a tragedy. So this is, I think, where you go from, and people will do it better. I think Gasoline Alley does this better. But where you go from just kind of jokes and, punchlines to these much bigger stories. And the Gumps is like kind of an early example of this. These much larger stories that will, just kind of go all over the place, but around kind of a central cast of characters. So that's the thing I like about the Gumps. Other than, I just think the art is somewhat appealing. It's not super impressive, but I think it's the coloring on this is pretty nice, especially this page jumps out at me. But yeah, I mean, these aren't, this is not at the same level as a, Little Nemo in Slumberland, or a even what we see in Gasoline Alley here. But they're interesting.
Okay,
They're just an interesting example to me.
Yeah, okay, that's also helpful, because I was really confused when reading. Like, I had to check multiple times that these were the same strip, because you've
Right.
got this like one where it's sort of a very standard run-of-the-mill, not that funny kind of physical /
Joke.
relational gag, and then just
Yeah.
like pounds of text and witches and frightening oriental gates and terrifically rich misers and and sailors, and I had no, and quite a depiction of a Chinese person, and just and I had no idea how to square those. But that's really striking, that it went from like such a completely comedic strip to an adventure strip, and
Mm-hmm.
also seemingly completely changed its storytelling style, because it was the page on the left is really a sort of very standard kind of gag strip in terms of its storytelling, and the one on the right is kind of more like a proto Prince Valiant in terms of, there's a little
Right.
bit of there are a few dialogue boxes, but mostly it's these lengthy uh narrative, or this lengthy narration that's sort of telling the story.
Yeah,
Yeah, that is
and
cool that
what
that
you
sort of
see here
shifted in
is
that way.
interesting, I think. Yeah, it's a shift that's interesting too, and not to read too much into this, but so many strips started out kind of what you have here on the left. So I think one of my all-time favorite strips is Wash Tub and Captain Easy, which is also collected here. But it started off like this sort of kind of gag a day kind of story, and then it just evolved into this sprawling globe hop trotting adventure strip, right? Very similar to this, and that's kind of what happened with the Gumps too, where these people had these real pedestrian stories that they would do, and there's some more melodrama and stuff that people loved. But then they started writing adventures. They'd send someone off on an adventure, and everyone would love that, or they just liked doing adventures more. So you see that evolution happen kind of often. Gasoline Alley, it doesn't really, but it does happen where you have these kind of you know uh, much more down to earth strips that evolve into like a grand adventure, which is just kind of interesting. But yeah, what did you think? Let's keep it on going. Polly and Her Pals is another interesting one. I actually have a very large collection of this. I think IDW, printed by IDW too. But what did you think of Polly and Her Pals as kind of another example of what was going on at this time?
I love the colors. I love the
Yeah,
coloring. It's like
yeah,
this is and this style, like, um the sort of the characters themselves are uh not kind of anything like especially surprising or anything, but just the sort of experimentation, especially on the strips that take place partially or entirely at night. Like,
yeah.
it's just so eye-catching. And I can see, yeah, I mean, it's funny because it's not one I'd ever heard of before you mentioned it. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and it's funny because there's like six or so of them in this collection, and I couldn't really exactly tell you what the setup is. Like, I don't really know. Like, Polly is the daughter or the cat or someone. Um,
Yeah.
and the pals are maybe or no, it's like the daughter. Yeah, it's like the daughter who's out. I don't know,
Mm-hmm.
but it grabbed me. Yeah, I love the
Yeah.
art.
This reminded me a lot, especially these little dot and dash characters that are like also just fills up the space. This reminds me a lot of Mutts, which I haven't read a ton of Mutts to be honest, but I know it's fairly well known. And the art I almost think has some of that kind of his character design. So it wouldn't surprise me if Mutts had some influence from Polly and Her Pals. But yeah, this reminded me mostly of Crazy Cat. It's not.
Yeah, me too.
It feels in the same vein where it's very experimental. The characters are kind of there's continuity and they're the same people, but it's almost like an excuse to hang these just like wild designs on, just kind of a framework for experimentation. I mean, if you look at these, they're just, you know, so elaborate, some of these, and just kind of, um, just in like designed in such, in interesting ways. Um, they're very stylized, really cool. I mean, uh, yeah, I don't know. There's just it does remind me a lot of kind of what Bill Harriman was up to. Different. I mean, they're different artists, and but very similar in the kind of experimentation that's going.
Yeah, and there are just particular panels that stick out at me too. Like the
Mm,
one, there's one where the father is like riding inside of uh the extra tire on the back of a car, and then the car goes
right.
over a rock and he sort of rolls down and ends up extraordinarily dizzy, and his somebody thinks he's drunk and is trying to help him. But just that one image uh towards the bottom when he gets out of the tire, and you have like circling different colored crescent moons going around his head, that just it is sort of what it feels like to be extremely dizzy, but also like it's just cool to look at, you know, the
Right.
and yeah, it's like
I mean,
I'd love to see more of it because it was really, and it's funny also because it was one I felt a little bit like a little kid reading these, the Polliner Palace specifically, because I was like not actually that interested in what the words were saying.
yeah. Yep.
You know, I just like I wanted to see what each panel was. And I was just like it was just so aesthetically pleasing to have the kind of play of colors
Mm.
that just
Yeah. And
yeah,
I
it
would
just
say
really
that's the
grabbed.
same with that whole collection is it kind of similar to Crazy Cat in that it's artistically interesting, even though maybe it's not super readable. I don't know, you know, because it's not something that's like you just got to know what's going to happen with the plot or anything like that. Uh, I mean, looking at that strip that you talked about, and just to describe it, that there's design choices that this artist is making with like the trees. They look somehow they're a tree, but it's got, you know, circles on it. It's got things that are look more like coat hangers than branches. Um, it's just there's so much interesting design and flourish happening with all the different objects here. This fence has these like what looks like eyeballs on it. I don't even know what I'm looking at there, but you know, it's really really fascinating. And you know, if nothing else, it just shows kind of the level of talent that you, if you, if you're like a little kid opening up the newspaper, you're seeing just some very, uh, some very talented kind of artistic experimentation happening, and in a way that I think it's not so much. You know, we talked about last time that a lot of stuff is still very illustrative. You know, it's not really in like the cartooning mold. This is very cartoony. This is very, you know, simple shapes, comical figures, things like that. So I don't know. It's interesting stuff.
Yeah,
Shall
I'm
we
really glad that you sort of called my
go?
attention to it before I got to it. Yeah. But yeah, go on to the next.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Moon Mullins. I'm just going to skip over these. We already talked about Little Nemo and Slumberland. These are fantastic strips here. I think really beautiful to look at if you're reading along, but we talked about that. So the next one I wanted to talk about, and there's only 2 pages here. There's more in the collection, but 2 Sunday examples. Is Barney Google and Sparkplug. And have you ever heard of Barney Google and Sparkplug before?
I'd heard of it, but I'd never read any.
Okay. I mean, believe it or not, if you open up a newspaper, it's still running. I think is it it's the second longest running strip in creation. So Snuffy Smith is a character that comes in, and it's commonly called Snuffy Smith, but Barney Google is still a character in it. So I mean, this is, you know, over 100 years old now. I think since it, you know, I think it launched in 1918. I'm not sure exactly, but you know, this is a long running one, and it's completely unreadable now. I mean, it's not funny at all. But the early, I mean, what did you think of these couple early strips here?
Um, yeah. So the first one, well, really both of them, like it was clever. I think particularly the first one, um, where he sort of goes to goes to Paris and is just shocked by how strange everyone was and everything is, and he doesn't kind of know how to cope with it, and then he, you know, sits down with a drink and is sort of so overwhelmed. You know, I never knew there were such types in the world. I could stay here for hours just sizing them up. And then a group of other tourists come and see him and say, "Look at that one, Howard. He doesn't look like he was all there. Shh, I want to get a picture of him and send it to the almanac." Just uh it got, you know, and he's sort of shocked, of course. I laughed at that one. And it was sort of, I mean, you know, not racially how we would do it now, but the kind of depiction of foreign cultures was interesting.
Yeah,
And and I sort of like the image also in the second one of him in the gondola.
Yeah.
But yeah, it didn't massively strike me.
Yeah, it's not something that was like you got to find more of this. I think where I got interested in Barney Google is later in the book. There's some of the daily strips that are collected. And here's an example of these in black and white, and um, I think there's something about so Billy DeBeck is a cartoonist. He was like a celebrity cartoonist back in the day. There was such a thing, very popular. This strip was like a huge hit. There's even songs that it might even gotten adapted into like some film serials or something like that. Um, but the thing I like about him as a cartoonist is he's doing some interesting stuff. If you look at his character designs, so that they're really loose. There's a lot of like just he's using inks and lines and shadows and blacks and whites really well. Um, but if you compare like look at like the design of like Barney Google to a one of these tycoons he meets, like they're radically different, right? They're the one character looks has this really ridiculous design. He's tiny, he's small, and then these people are like twice his size. They look much more realistically like a normal human being. So this is just another, I think, of kind of the innovation that's happening with some cartoonists, where you they're mixing kind of character designs in their world in a way that you wouldn't think should work, but it does. And they're kind of figuring out how to be more expressive with just ink lines, get those different shades and stuff. And also just kind of mix different characters into the world in ways that I think early on doesn't work so well. Like some of the designs are kind of grotesque and weird, but these are more kind of fun and recognizable as human beings kind of living in the same world. I don't know. It's not a huge one, but it is interesting just to kind of see like what was going on in the early days. And these have had such lasting power in the fact that, man, they're still around today. They've just kind of set the template for how cartooning works.
Uh-huh.
I also think that there's a nice little, he has a nice knack for some catchy dialogue. I always like that. Do you mind if I join you in packing a few groceries line? I thought that was kind of a fun one. Fun way to ask for food. But
yeah,
Barney Google's a hard one to find. I've gotten an old collection of his as well. Interesting stuff. Yeah, it's kind of fun to read. But it's like it's really hard to find collections of this sort of stuff. So kind of lost treasure.
Yeah. Now, last but not least, Gasoline Alley just blew me away.
Mm-hmm.
Because I had I knew that people loved Gasoline Alley, but my only kind of encounters with it had been sort of in its most recent form, where it is, a kind of sweet comic centered around a gas station,
Right.
And I'd known that it had been very popular and influential because of the decision to have the characters age.
Mm-hmm.
And I knew, I knew the name Skeezix, the kid who the orphan who was adopted. But that was about the extent of my knowledge. And then I got to these Sunday strips, and I didn't realize just how, frankly, artistically sophisticated they were. And I was really struck. I really liked I think my two favorites were probably the one where the kids sort of run off, where they're supposed, the car's broken down and they go off, and then the one where the sort of adopted dad and Skeezix are walking sort of through the forest and talking about why it is that the color of the leaves change, and and they fall, and the way that the sort of trees sort of sleep for the winter. Both of those I was really struck by. Yeah, those are definitely my two favorites, but I really liked all of them. There was that one where it was sort of set up as, you know, a normal like left to right, top to bottom newspaper strip, but the whole thing made one image.
Yeah.
And I thought that was really cool.
Yeah.
You know, and then there's the one that feels sort of like a riff on Little Nemo. Um, but yeah, I don't know. Yeah, what do you kind of know about Gasoline Alley, and what do you think of it? I guess because you're you know coming at it with a lot more sort of experience. So I'm just kind of like wow, you know.
Yeah. Yeah, if you could read, I think, yeah. So these are a great introduction, and I think you're right in that, you know, if you only know Frank King from kind of his daily strips, then you're not realizing, you probably don't realize how good he is. I love this last one too. So there's Frank King, the author of Gasoline Alley, is someone who's so gifted with shadows. He'll use them a lot to
Yeah.
just kind of get mood into scenes, especially when things like, it's kind of a joke, like whenever something gets romantic in Gasoline Alley, like everyone suddenly goes into shadow, you know, and but it's really, it's a trick he does, but it's really effective, where, you know, these people will be like, you know, walking in, you know, in the moonlight at night or something like that, having a serious conversation. And it's like stuff like this, where you can only see like the shadows of the moon going across them, you know? And it's so evocative. And even this reminds me so much of just like, we're looking at this one where Uncle Walt and Skeezix are having, you know, kind of a fun little conversation, but they're walking through what looks like an autumn kind of landscape. And you just, I don't know, it's so evocative to me of being there. You can just kind of feel it, um, you know, with the way that the light is, and, you know, it feels like a sunset that's, you know, maybe an afternoon or late afternoon that they're walking through here. And it's the colors, the color choices, the way that the light is, you know, moving across the characters. It's really beautiful. But it's subtle, I think, I'd say, even more so than some of these other strips, right? That there's a subtlety to it. Um, with, you know, his characters are simply designed, but it's really, yeah, it's beautiful. I think these are, you know, really impressive, just from an artistic standpoint. But even little touches like this, where, you know, on one strip that it's Skeezix and Corky looking into a pond, and Skeezix says, "Oh, I wish we had time. Wouldn't it be great for a swim?" And then reflected in the pond is their word balloon upside down and flipped. Little touches, like little
Yeah,
kind
I
of
love
whimsical
that.
touches. Yeah. Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, and look at this next panel.
I don't
I
think
mean,
I've
God,
ever seen somebody do that. And it seems like it once I saw it done, it was sort of like, oh, why haven't I seen this before, right? It's
right.
yeah, and it works particularly. I think the coloring is really great too, that it sort of calls attention to it and yeah.
I mean, Gasoline Alley is, I'd say, it's a strip. I have a couple collections of like the first daily strips, and then one collection from, I think, the 60s or 70s, after Frank King wasn't drawing. I think it's probably the 70s, after Frank King wasn't drawing it anymore, and the story had kind of moved, and, you know, Walt is now, you know, Skeezix is a grown man, and Uncle Walt is running for mayor. He's an, you know, man in his 60s. It seems like, you know, I think he's got to be like 120 now. So I don't know what the strip is doing. I haven't kept up with it. But it is interesting. So these old strips, I mean, you think about it, right? Like, they would tell these stories, you know, that were so sprawling. So he drew this, I think, for, you know, a good 40 years plus. And, you know, to cover the lives of these characters, it's really a remarkable achievement. Where, you know, the story of Gasoline Alley is basically Walt is a, you know, a mechanic in a, you know, just kind of working class neighborhood, and someone puts a baby on his doorstep one night, who is Skeezix, and says, "This is Skeezix, please take care of him." Right, and that's kind of the story and the cast of characters surrounding this. And there's, you know, Skeezix will grow up and go to war in World War II. There's romance. Walt gets married. You know, it covers all these plot lines of comedy and melodrama. it's just like, I don't even know. It'd be so hard to digest like 40 years of storytelling with that. It's very, and if you wanted to read like the whole story of the Gasoline Alley Gang, I mean, now you're at 100 years of daily comic strips. It's really like, it's pretty remarkable. And the early stuff though is very, it's very fun to read. I mean, the characters are delightful, and the art is really good. So if you're looking for a good example of kind of how these strips worked back in the day, I'd say Gasoline Alley is probably the best one. It moves very slow, but it's very fun to read. It's very cozy.
Yeah, after spending time with these Sunday strips, I'm really intrigued to go to the early daily strips and read some of those sometime, because it just the fact that he was doing this on the Sundays, I know the Sundays were kind of the more experimental one, but it makes me really intrigued to see just the kind of, as you said, sort of slow pace, kind of building out of the world in the daily strip. So I'm really intrigued to check those out sometime.
And you can find these they're on Amazon. They're called Walt and Skeezix, kind of the collections of the dailies. I think the Sunday strip was collected by Dark Horse, at least a couple years of it, of Sunday strips. I mean, that would be interesting to own, but I don't own that one. But they're worth reading. I mean, don't expect like a page turner necessarily, because one of the things about the daily strips is like, they developed plot over years. So sometimes like, it takes a long time for a couple who's been like teasing each other that they're going to fall in love to actually, it's going to happen, But a lot of these move very slow compared to what you'd expect, but they're really pleasant to read. And I think, I recommend it at least. I enjoy
Well, they move a lot faster now because you can read them at once rather than one a day for years.
Right. Yeah. All right. Anything else to add?
I always feel a little bit like I'm cheating, sort of reading these longer strips now. But it's just so nice to like sit down and read, a year of Prince Valiant or 6 months of Terry and the Pirates, and sort of say, okay, like I actually got, the sort of real chunk of story here.
Yeah.
And especially with a daily strip, like the old, Mickey Mouse, the Floyd Gottfredson Mickey Mouse ones, where I can sit down and just read a story versus over the course of 2 or 3 months, having to go day by day.
Yeah. It's a great marketing tactic. I mean, if you think about it, like once you get hooked on these things, would you cancel your newspaper subscription if you, were waiting for the adventure to end? I mean,
yeah.
Oh, all right. Anything else to add before we wrap up today?
No, I think that kind of covers it. These were really, I really enjoyed these. It was a diverse set of comics, and I was just struck by kind of the development and some of the sophistication of a few of them, particularly Polly and her pals and Gasoline Alley. But I really enjoyed those.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's one of the, I've said this before, but one of the things I love about this particular collection of newspaper strips is that it just gives you a taste, right? So maybe you're just floored by Polly and her pals. You want to find more. And, that's a fun little adventure to go find, dig up more Polly and her pals. Or maybe you want to understand more about the world of Gasoline Alley. And same thing, right? You can go off. And these are not easy to find. That's kind of part of the fun of tracking them down, too. Yeah. So again, well done, Bill Blackbeard. Great collection. And
yeah. So we'll be reading some more of the Smithsonian collection of comics in a couple episodes time. But next episode we'll be turning to the beginning of Hellboy by Mike Mignola. We'll be reading Seed of Destruction, which is I think the first 4 issues. It's the sort of first collected graphic novel. So
and a radical departure from what we were reading today.
Yeah. We like to keep everyone on their toes. So if you enjoyed this episode of Truth Beauty Comics, there are 3 things you can do for the podcast to support it. The first is to keep listening to us and tell your friends about our work.
The second is to review the podcast, giving it 5 stars wherever you listen to us.
And the last thing you can do is consider contributing to our Patreon with a monthly donation. For as little as $3 a month, you can get perks like access to exclusive episodes. And we need to record some more because we actually just got a new patron, Lillian. So thank you for that. Voting on upcoming episodes, topics, and even an original drawing from Levi. But most of all, you can help make this podcast sustainable.
That's the end of the episode. You can reach us at truthbeautycomics@gmail.com or on our social media accounts. Thanks for listening. Remember to take comics seriously and have fun while doing it.